Very good morning, distinguished guests and colleagues. My name is Nghĩa Chinh, and I'm currently working for Plan International Asia Pacific Regional Hub as Regional Resilience and School Safety Specialist. I am here today representing the Asia Pacific Coalition for School Safety to welcome you all to the Regional Consultation Meeting on the 2022-2030 revisions of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework. Many thanks to many of you who are making your time to join with us in this consultation meeting. We look forward to having your inputs and comments, as well as exchanging discussion points during this consultation meeting. For our meeting today, please note the following housekeeping rules to engage with speakers and participants during the meeting. Please use the chat box to say hello and introduce your name with the agency that you are representing. You can also please share your comments and ask questions using the chat box. During the presentation, please keep your microphone muted if you are not speaking, and also kindly raise your hands to voice up. The key objectives of our consultation meeting today will be to share information on the draft of the revised Comprehensive School Safety Framework 2022-2030. We are also looking forward to collect feedbacks on the appropriateness of the length and user-friendliness of the framework, or any potential red flags, issues, glaring omissions to the framework that you are identifying. We are also hoping to have your suggestions on new actions or strategies that were not included in the current draft framework. For the meeting agenda, today we will hear a presentation from the a presentation on the Comprehensive School Safety Framework revision process and the updated version, which will be shared by Dr. Niven Nezovic, Education in Emergency Specialist from UNICEF, which is the chair of the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reductions and Resilience in Education Sector, or GADRRRES. After that, there will be a round of Q&A and discussion, which will be moderated by our colleagues, Nadia Pulmano from Save the Children, who is a technical advisor for disaster risk reductions and school safety. Save the Children is also a member of the Asia Pacific Coalition for School Safety. And then we will close our meeting today with the next steps. So for now, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Niven Nezovic, Education in Emergency Specialist from UNICEF, who will be sharing the presentation on the Comprehensive School Safety Framework revision process and the updated version. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Dr. Niven Nezovic. Thank you.
Originally drafted some years ago, so this is not a new document per se, but an update to a document that a number of countries have already adopted. And I think the last count we had, it was some 58 countries globally that are already using this framework, the old version anyways. And a number of other countries are already quite interested in taking up the revised framework, especially given the increasing importance of climate change and the transformative role that education has in terms of addressing the impacts of climate change, but also mitigating the risks that climate change has on education for children globally. So maybe the first thing, if we can go to the next slide, Lucille, thank you. Just a bit of background on GADRRRES. So GADRRRES sprang from a number of, and GADRRRES stands for the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Education Sector. And it grew from a number of discussions some time ago in the mid-noughts, when there was a real big push to try and take more concerted action to address the growing impacts of climate change. And we'll share this PowerPoint with you so you can read the details of here, but essentially the Disaster Risk Reduction and Education and Knowledge Hub under UNDRR became a thematic platform to really promote the work around climate change through education. And springing from that, the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in the Education Sector was established in 2013. And at that time, Lucille, if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. There were a number of partners that joined the alliance, like-minded partners working around this particular agenda, covering UN as well as INGO agencies. And we've included the logos of these different partners in this particular slide, but there are 17 general members of GADRRRES, comprised of a broader membership to what, as well as a core secretariat of around 5 key partners, including Save the Children, UNICEF, UNESCO, and with the chair of GADRRRES, this is done on a biannual kind of rotating basis between UNICEF and UNESCO. Over to the next slide, please, Lucille. Thank you. Now, GADRRRES, in terms of, in addition to having this global alliance of partners working around this common agenda, there are also 2 very strong and very active regional affiliates under GADRRRES. One is, of course, in the Asia Pacific region under the Coalition for School Safety, and then also in the Latin America and Caribbean region, which is comprised of a number of different governments and partners in that region. And both of these regional affiliates have been quite active over the years, engaging in a lot of work around this particular agenda. And we've seen in these 2 regions where we've had the greatest uptake of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework to date. Next slide, Lucille. Thank you. Okay. So the overall vision and mission of GADRRRES as an alliance is really to strengthen our coordination and advocate for school safety measures through education in response to climate change and other hazards. The aim being, of course, to strengthen the overall resilience in the education sector. The idea being that this will help us collectively achieve SDG goals by 2030, and certainly in recognition of the hugely negative impacts that different types of disruptions to learning have for children. And one of the key tools for this, of course, has been the development of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, which adopts an all hazards approach to risk reduction in the education sector, and focusing on a number of different areas around strengthening policies, supporting governments and partners, strengthen their risk-informed approaches and programming to mitigate potential impacts on education, and also coordinating with other sectors to leverage benefits for children. And of course, the Alliance, and with the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, looks to do this through the policy level at national level, but also programming level at subnational levels. So depending on the country context, that will be the regional, district, and right down to community levels, working with partners in these different contexts that might be affected by different types of emergencies. Next slide, Lucille. Okay, here we go. So, and I hear someone is joining us. I think that's Surangrat is joining the discussion, but maybe go on mute. That would be great. Thanks, Surangrat. So the background of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, as I noted earlier, was originally launched in 2012. And it was actually introduced by the Asia Pacific Coalition for School Safety, and endorsed by a number of ministries in the region. And tied to that was also the development of the CSSF targets that were developed and finalized through a series of global consultations. And of course, subsequent to this, through a number of other phases, the framework was adopted and endorsed by a number of partners and countries globally. and is now currently being used by these countries. But back in 2019, there was also a recognition among a number of the partners that given the changing nature of some of the risks that we're facing in the education sector, the growing impacts of COVID-19, growing risks of displacement and climate change, and violence generally against children, there was certainly a need to update the framework to better reflect different hazards that are facing the education sector. So if you go to the next slide, Lucille, please, thank you. So, so the idea, of course, around this update is that we really want to be with partners focusing on a much stronger all hazards and a risk-informed approach, looking at a number of the areas that are listed here, but specifically strengthening the work around issues related to climate change, around potential educational disruptions as a result of pandemics. You know, COVID-19, of course, is the best example of this recently, but there have been a number of other pandemics that have led to, you know, significant impacts on learning in children and learning for children in education. Of course, a much stronger focus on conflict and violence and how to not only respond to these sorts of risks, but to use education as a transformative platform through which to reduce those risks and transform some of the dynamics that give rise to those risks in the first place. Now, I won't go into the detail of the linkages with some of the other global frameworks, but we've listed several of these here that the CSSF ties into very clearly. And a number of you, I'm sure, are quite aware of these, but around the SDGs, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sendai framework itself, which was the original genesis of the CSSF framework, the Safe Schools Declaration. Some of you might be aware that there was just this big event in Nigeria held around the SSD, and of course the INE minimum standards for education service delivery in emergency situations. And INE, of course, is the interagency network on education in emergencies. Next slide, Lucille. Okay, thank you. So I think I've touched on this a little bit, but the purpose of the update is, again, to respond to some of these growing risks and hazards that have emerged over the past several years. And one of the big changes, of course, and a potential gap that existed in the previous framework was also strengthening this area around the foundations, the policy level, the planning, the system strengthening, capacity development components of the framework, and how collectively we can work towards strengthening areas to support national level capacities around risk-informed approaches in the education sector, and strengthening this linkage, what some people refer to as the nexus between humanitarian and development programming. And I think we've lost, of course, the slide now, but I will nevertheless continue. Oh, there we go, we're back to it. And maybe the next slide here. So I won't go into too much detail on this one, but maybe what I can do is we can jump to, well, the idea underpinning, and actually what is worth noting here, you know, one of the theories of change, of course, underpinning this whole alliance globally is that collectively partners and with ministries and governments will have a much stronger impact working together. And so essentially the CSSF framework tries to provide this common tool through which we can all better align our work and strengthen results for children in education. And of course, the approach uses this socioeconomical kind of framework where we're looking right from focusing on the needs of the child, but addressing needs and risks right through different levels of society. Next slide, Lucille. Thank you. And okay, so now the objectives of the framework. Again, I won't go into it in too much detail because I'm working on the assumption that colleagues have looked through this, and maybe I'll only focus on the objectives in the updated and revised framework, where we've tweaked these slightly to have a stronger focus around issues of protection for learners, strengthening planning processes to ensure issues such as continuity of learning and minimizing disruptions to learning in the face of some of these different hazards that are increasing over time. And of course, importantly, to protect the investments that have already been made in education. Some of you might be aware of the recent evidence around educational losses associated with school closures as a result of COVID-19. I think those are quite indicative of the broader losses that we experience because of disruptions to learning for children, and also in worst case scenarios, destruction of education facilities or attack against personnel and so on. And to have a much stronger focus on these transformative elements of the CSSF framework through school level interventions around strengthening cultures of risk reduction and resilience, but also strengthening the capacities of children and service providers and duty bearers around resilience approaches in education, whether that's around conflict, around climate change, around health-related issues, and so on, and protection. Next slide, Lucille. Okay, so in the framework, of course, the updated framework, there are now essentially 4 pillars that we've been proposing, and we've gone through this consultation with partners now for, it's getting close to a year, actually. And we've had a number of discussions with the GADRRRES Alliance partners around these updates. And what we've landed on is essentially retaining the 3-pillar approach around safer school or safe school facilities, school safety and educational continuity that we're trying to strengthen as well, and education for risk reduction and resilience. So some slight changes to reflect the evolution in thinking and needs in this area, and also adding this core area around the foundations, essentially a pillar itself, but really this one is looking at the system level elements around strengthening resilience in the education sector, which was there in the previous version, but not explicitly outlined. And so we've tried to address that we're trying to address that in these updates. Next slide, Lucille. Okay, great. So now the overall structure, and I think, again, you've looked at this, but includes basically an area around scope of each of the pillars, what it's really looking at so that it's very clearly explained, we hope, who some of the key actors, both primary and secondary actors involved in each of the different areas are, and what some of their key responsibilities should entail. And then also some recommended strategies, which are not prescriptive, but they're just included to give a sense to users of the manual, of the framework, what kinds of strategies might appropriately fit under each of the different areas. Next slide, Lucille. Yes, okay. So before going into this, just to quickly note, oh yes, okay, this is there. So part of the work and to ensure we've captured a number of the different issues that have been suggested in the updates. What we found was that going into a huge level of detail in all areas of the framework would turn it into a very, very long document, which is not the purpose of the framework. But to overcome the need for having clear guidance and depth on certain issues, what we have proposed with partners is that the framework will be short and focused, but in the framework, we'll have links to these additional supplemental guidance tools for each of the different areas that are listed in the framework. And that would cover, of course, these areas around the foundations and the three pillars, as well as what's called a comprehensive school safety assessment suite that provides a number of tools to do analyses, and that in turn are also linked to some of the global tools that exist with partners. And these, of course, these supplemental guidance tools will be quite extensive, potentially, and they're in place to help users draw on whatever resources are relevant to their particular context. Next slide, Lucille. Okay, so the timeline and steps. Now, we've been going through this process for some time now, but where we are today, we have left open feedback for the framework until the 18th of November, in which case we will incorporate additional comments or suggestions from partners, including in this forum. We are currently consolidating feedback from an external consultation that was done with countries and partners globally, and that was completed. The feedback phase of that was completed at the end of September recently, and we're still going through pulling all of that together. And so we do have time to receive these additional inputs from many colleagues in this forum. And we're hoping, the reason that the hard deadline for additional feedback is the 18th of November is that the idea is that will give us enough time to address any additional suggestions provided, after which the updated framework will go for an independent peer review. And we've already set up a peer review panel to go through this and give it this quality assurance aspect that we want to have as part of this process. And then once that is done, of course, we'll finalize based on the independent peer review of these external technical experts, do a copy edit of the document just to make sure it flows very nicely. And then, of course, it'll be finalized. We'll do the layout and it will be translated into, we've listed here 5 major languages, but I think that would include like English, we don't need to translate probably, but French, Spanish, and the other languages, I'm not entirely clear what those would be, but we'll figure those out. But we're leaving enough space to, Arabic, I think would be one, but we're leaving enough space to respond to demands of partners as well here. So additional languages are always possible. And of course, tied to that is the targets and indicators around the framework, which are also almost done, but those will be kept very short and simple, and of course tied to key global indicators that all partners in the education sector are working towards anyways. And those are typically going to be tied to key SDG indicators around goal area 4 for education. Next slide, Lucille. Okay, I think that is it for the slides. Now, I hope that didn't put anyone to sleep, but fortunately on your side, it's still the morning. So, you would have had your coffee already, and hopefully that helped you get through the presentation. But I'm happy to respond to or clarify any questions that colleagues might have about the presentation itself. And of course, the idea of the presentation really, I think, was just to give colleagues on the call a sense of what this initiative is about, where we're at with it now, and hopefully what the benefit will be for you on the ground as well as partners. Noting again that there are a number of big events right now around climate change action globally with partners and so on, and so this is an increasingly important agenda. And through the GADRRRES Alliance and a number of other partners much more broadly, there is, I think, a growing recognition of how important it is to work on this area through education. So thank you, colleagues, and maybe back to you, and open to any follow-up. Yeah. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nevin, for your sharing and the presentations. Also, thank you, Dr. Nevin, because you are sharing with us from your late time. I know that you are based in New York, so it's very late there. So appreciate that. And yeah, back to our consultation meeting, everyone. For the next step, we want to open the floor for everyone to share comments or questions. And for these sessions, our colleague Nadia Pumano, who is the technical advisor for DRR, Disaster Risk Reductions and School Safety from Save the Children, a member of the Asia Pacific Coalition for School Safety, will be helping us to moderate this session. And yeah, again, the chat box is open for everyone to share the comments, or you can also raise your hands so that Nadia can invite you to speak up. And Niven, Dr. Niven will continue to stay with us and help us to address your questions or comments, if any. Thank you, and I hand over to Nadia, please.
Thank you very much, Nia, and thank you very much, Nevin, for sharing with us the progress on the CSS framework, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to from the Asia Pacific to provide feedback, initial feedback to this initiative. So at this point, we will be starting to take on questions or clarifications or any reflections on the revised version of the document of the CSS. I see some people raising their hands. Yeah, please go ahead, Marlon. Marlon from the Philippines.
No, Miss Nadia, sorry, I'm okay. I just lost out.
Nadia, we have Rachel already shared the question in the chat box, and we also have Wanda, and after that.
Okay, yes. Okay, so there is one question, Nevin, from Rachel from the Philippines. The question is, what is the rationale for explicitly mentioning education continuity in Pillar 2? What about the protection continuity?
Yep. No, very good question. And I saw there was also another question about M&D and learning being included. So the first on educational continuity, I think one of the, and I think something we've all seen actually over the last year and a bit, how negatively impacted education systems were during COVID, especially with a lot of the school closures in a number of countries. If you all recall, during its peak, there were around 1.6 billion children, adolescents as well, through university levels also, impacted as a result of varying levels of school closure. And in a lot of countries, especially where systems were not so well developed, these prolonged school closures have had really disastrous impacts upon the learning of a lot of children, and a lot of learning losses as well. That's kind of adding to an already a pretty acute global learning crisis in some context. So, essentially the idea was, and this was the idea of ensuring learning continuity measures were in place via the CSSF framework were already referred to in the original iteration of the framework. But given how poorly equipped a lot of systems were in terms of responding to COVID and other hazards as well, we felt it would be it would be a good idea to really emphasize this moving forward. I mean, actually what we're also seeing, just to note very briefly, is that as some countries are coming out of COVID, one of the big lessons that has emerged and potential benefits moving forward is that the learning continuity measures that a number of countries have implemented to keep children learning are being applied to other types of emergency contexts. And this is something I think we would all benefit from moving forward. So that's kind of the idea and the rationale for that. In terms of the issues of protection, excellent question. And I think the framework itself does emphasize issues of protection throughout. And I mean, I think the framing of learning continuity refers to this specific issue I discussed a moment ago. And of course, protection issues for children are consistent as well, but you don't have the same kind of learning continuity issue in a sense, right? So it's just a terminology, the way that it's framed. But we would definitely agree and underscore the importance of having these protection measures in place for children in all contexts as well. And that's one of the objectives of the framework. M&D, yes, that's in there as well. So I won't go into it too much detail, and that's part of the indicators approach. And of course, learning, that's another big one that does come out and is emphasized much more clearly within this framework. And again, one of the issues moving forward is to emphasize that children are learning and that we're able to address this learning crisis for children globally through learning continuity measures, but also through improving the capacity and skills of teachers. And some of these elements come up a bit more strongly in Pillar 3 of the framework, I think, than the other pillars. But again, we're very welcome. We're welcoming all comments and suggestions from colleagues to make sure we capture suggestions made. So hopefully that's helpful, but I'm happy to look at other questions as well. So back to you. Thank you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nevin.
There you go.
So we have some people raising their hands for some questions. Marlon, please go ahead.
Hi, Miss Nadia. Sorry, I'm
Yes.
not sure who's that Marlon, because yeah, I'm not
Oh,
raising. Yeah.
You're not raising your hands. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's move to Vanda from Plan International.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good to see familiar names, all the DRR practitioner and Safe School champion in the region. Thank you, Nevin, for the presentation. So my name is Vanda from Plan International, a colleague of Nia. I also saw the latest version of the document, and then also what you just mentioned in your presentation. Really happy that now the revision is considering the violence situation. So I'm just wondering how it is going to be balanced to putting all the context with the refugee, because we know that this has become crucial. Second one is about pandemic, because we know that COVID-19, we're going still to dealing with this in the number of years, considering the context itself. Maybe, I mean, in the version that I read, I still not really see so much on that one. The third one, I saw the number of the reference document that been putting under the current version is already mentioned the Safe School Declaration, which is all the violence and the children, attack to the education component. The second one also the Paris Agreement. But I'm just wondering whether it's going to be expanded to also include. We have a lot of reference on how to protect children during the pandemic situation. Also, the protection issue that you just mentioned, but I didn't see yet been included, for example, reference toward the Global Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. There is a lot of also ongoing discussion at the moment on how to protect children and relate with education. And the last question, how GADRRRES or all of us have to balance, because now it's become like combine many things, right, in the comprehensive school safety. What will be your suggestion on how we balance when we use this framework? People will not confuse. I mean, when using the framework itself. Okay, thank you very much. Over.
Thanks, Vanda. A lot of very good questions, of course. Let me start with the last one before we go to other colleagues, because I'm already forgetting all of the the very good questions from Vanda. So maybe someone can help remind me, but maybe I'll start on the last one first around using the framework, because it's a very good comment or a question. The idea, one of the approaches of the framework and all of the tools associated with the framework, of course, is that, you know, whatever the resilience measures, the mitigation measures, the response measures, the capacity development measures that are deployed in a particular country will be based on the needs in that country. So while the framework itself covers a whole range of issues, you know, I think there is definitely not an expectation that everything in that framework is something that would have to be implemented in a particular country. So it's all going to be context specific, and that's going to be that will grow from whatever the risk analysis is in that particular country. And there are a number of tools, the supplemental resources that will be provided as part of the framework to help country teams, partners, governments identify what are the risks in that country, what are the hazards that need to be addressed, and whatnot. So hopefully that answers that one, if I understood the question correctly. I think in terms of the reference to the child protection issue, I think it's a good point. I think, you know, generally we see education and child protection as being hand in glove, you know, working very closely together in every context. And, you know, again, the idea is that there will be a number of supplemental resources that are linked to the framework that can help partners and colleagues implement whatever their measures are in a particular country by drawing on those particular resources. Now on the refugee issue, and also IDPs as well, I would suggest, because we've got to remember the number of IDPs globally is still unfortunately higher than the number of refugees. I think it's around double the number, right? 42 or so million IDPs and around 26 million refugees. So, you know, I think forcibly displaced populations combined are an issue. And a lot of these measures, of course, are also applicable to these IDP refugee populations as well, across all of the different pillars. And I think, again, if you use the tool and apply them for these populations, they're also going to be useful and relevant. And there will be supplemental guidance materials on how this can be done linked to the framework. Now, across these issues, if additional elaboration or explanation is needed in the framework, I mean, of course, please provide those comments, and the team that's working on consolidating all of the inputs from colleagues will work to address those and make sure that these linkages are explicitly outlined in the document with those linkages to the supplemental resources provided. Thank you. Back to you, Nadia. Hopefully that helped answer the question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nevin and Vanda. We also have another question from Bevita from Indonesia.
Hi Nadia, hi Nevin. Hi. I'm Bevita from Refugee and Asia Pacific. So I would actually I'm glad when I saw this framework also accommodated for the climate change issue. But however, I also noticed that the climate change is actually for this framework is actually related about the context as a hazard. I mean, like speaking from the result from the climate change assessment from the APCSS, I think we also acknowledge about how the climate change actually resulted from the human activities. But I don't know how actually in this framework, whether it can be accommodated also related about greening the CSS, because I saw on the last version, the draft now, it is only mentioning on the framework about the green school, but how we coordinate or how's the operation of for the government, also local, for the NGO as well, in terms of like the greening, I mean, in mode of operation. I think, yeah, how we can accommodate that as well under the framework. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Bu Bevita. Assalamualaikum juga. Saya bekerja di Indonesia dulu ya, jadi senang dengar suara orang Indonesia sini. So just saying hello to Bevita colleagues. I spent a lot of time working in Indonesia, and of course my wife is Indonesian, so it's nice to hear an Indonesian colleague on the call. Yeah, so on the question of greening, I mean, I think there are a number of suggestions made under the Pillar 3 and also other policy pillars of the framework on how to ensure, we're having environmentally friendly, climate sensitive kind of approaches to education. And there will be a number of supplemental resources linked to the framework that will go into a lot more detail around some of these issues. And again, I think this is just the balance we had to strike around trying to create a short, digestible framework that will cover a number of these issues in a comprehensive sort of approach, allowing partners to identify what their context-specific needs are and then draw on those additional resources and have a well-informed strategy or approach that would address, whether it's climate change or other types of, and multiple hazards sometimes as well in a particular context, climate change and conflict, for example, or displacement or whatever it might be. But no, a very good question, and of course we're welcome to take on these additional comments. Looking at some of the comments in the chat box also, the issue of gender, of course, is central to everything we do in the Alliance and with our partners as well. And there will be supplemental resources on that. Climate justice, I'd have to look at the most recent iteration of the document. But again, I think a lot of these issues will come out in the supplemental resources linked to the document. We're very happy to take on suggestions. So this one, for example, around strengthening work with government and NGO partners and forming a secretariat at national, regional levels, I think that's a great strategy to suggest for colleagues to include under that pillar area, and please do share, and we'll try to incorporate any suggestions into the document. And of course, the framework does look at this issue of emergency rehabilitation development phases. So that whole nexus issue, right? Looking from the preparedness to the response to the recovery aspects of the work in different types of humanitarian situations, different types of fragile situations, contexts where there are risks to education. So I think that the answer to that one is definitely yes. And yes, strong. So hopefully that helps. But yeah, so back to you, Nadia. I think there are other hands as well.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much again, Nevin. Now we have some questions from the Department of Education, the DADRRRES in the Philippines. Director Ranilda.
Nadia, thank you, and Nevin, thank you so much. I came in a bit late, and so I am not sure whether I captured everything. Well, I guess I'm pretty sure I did not capture everything, having come in late. The thing that I've been thinking about is one, because this is the time to really kind of update or at least revise the entire thing. I hope that we could be more really looking at it in a more strategic way. Our experience in the Philippines, for instance, have led us to thinking, because we have had struggle with making this fit in really in terms of the awareness of people of looking at, pillars instead of looking at, because the laws, in fact, of or DRR, in fact, is articulated in terms of preparedness, response, prevention, and mitigation, and all that. So recent study, in fact, that SAVE has done for us, while we are using this comprehensive school safety framework, in conjunction with what I've mentioned as the DRR components, our field and schools have difficulty getting familiar with the three pillars. They are more familiar with, what's prevention and mitigation, what's, all that preparedness. So that when that study was done, when you ask the ground in the school level, they know it. They kind of don't. But then if you begin to give them the areas for the pillars, they exactly know them, so that's one. Yeah, I see some people here whom I know even way back. Hello, Bunli. I miss you guys. When I saw your name and the rest, Bevit I also saw. But anyhow, good to see all of you. The other thing, so that's one. That's why we're trying to reconfigure, in fact, with our own in the Philippines. It's taken a bit of some years, but that is one of the things I want to really kind of really revise, because we indeed use the three pillars, but in conjunction with this disaster risk reduction terms or areas. So we're trying to figure out how that becomes more really like, is it a choice of what to use and all this, so people don't get confused. That's one area. The other area I'd like to point out is looking at, are we referring to school, or are we referring to the education sector as a whole? Especially now that we are in the midst of the pandemic, where education is no longer just within the school, but within homes, and more so even pre-pandemic, which we have not really touched significantly from the work that we have been doing in the last 5 years, is the idea of learning centers outside the schools, but are within communities, but are also accredited or recognized by the Department of Education in the Philippines, for instance. So I'm looking at more of education and where education is taking place, right? And therefore the centrality of it is not the school, but rather the centrality of it is the learners, the students. So I'm looking at the framework, and I'm looking at where in the framework is the centrality of the students. So this is a reflection I've had for the last 5 years of my work. That's one which I am trying to figure out how it's gonna come out in a framework. So that level, and if we're talking then of learners as the centrality, or the students as the centrality of safe, I don't know, safe school, so safe education, if I would be more comprehensive with it, is what then, and this is where, because we talk of protection, but I talk of bigger rights. I don't want to look at protection alone, but I would like to look at the rights in terms of participation, of development, those clusters of rights. Protection is one of them, of course. Survival is also part of it. So the learners are central. What do the rights do? And within those rights, how are they then to be exercised within, when you say school? So if you want to use the pillars, in fact, in our case right now, though we have not actually revised the pillars, pillar 1 for us now is more called as safe learning facility, safe learning environment and facilities, because we realize that what goes into the environment, such as all this, because we have all this gardening in schools and all that, right, which actually hamper evacuation when students have to get out and they are placed and located, we realize that, we need to also provide guidance on how really an environment where there is movement and all that should be. And that's the physical environment for us. So we've actually named it like that, which is not reflected yet in the policy that we have. So that's one, looking at so how then do you, because the pillars, if you're looking at it, apply to the pillars that we have now. We're looking at, I said the entire clusters of rights, and where in the schools maybe the pillars can be. So I don't know. I'm asking the questions and I'm throwing my own reflection. I don't have really the answers. I'm trying to look for the answers myself in the last years. The other thing is, so what then can you say about school, homes, learning in homes, and even in learning communities where there are, of course, local governments, partnerships and all other, especially for our out-of-school youth, Neven, because we have out-of-school youth that do have places within the schools, meaning there are infrastructures or classrooms that can be used, but there are also those that are actually outside the schools. And I want to reach in terms of when we now look at education is reaching the most vulnerable as well. And so I'm not looking at those only who are actually within the classrooms or more privileged. I'm looking at also those who are outside the classroom setting. So that's what I've been trying to wrestle with, in fact. So within that broader, so I have the feeling, and I haven't wrapped myself around the entire thing of these reflections, that this comprehensive school safety framework has to really change a bit drastically in my sense, rather than just updating it. Because the other thing now that I'm looking at is where so those are parts of the question. The other part of the question that I have is, where does the framework articulate really the coming together of climate change and risk reduction? How does the framework actually come to articulate that and reflect that? And if conflict is coming around, of which I'm not comfortable at this point, it's not to say that I know no, I perfectly don't, Neven. It's for me. It's for me a question of understanding theoretical underpinnings of where convergence and departure should be understood, which I have had not the time to actually sit down and do that, but my brain has been telling me that you need to be able to see convergence and departure to be able to articulate it. It's easier, of course, the convergence of climate change and be able to kind of put it together there in this framework. The framework, having said that, the framework for me has been lacking really in the articulation of the convergence of climate change and DRR. And I think that this is a chance that articulation should be made, because climate change is at the forefront of every issue that we're confronted right now. That's not to say that it should subsume everything about, other hazards and risk reduction for that matter, but that it should actually be reflected and nuanced. I think I'll stop there, Neven, because these are the things I've been wrestling with. I am hoping that my team, because the administration will have our elections already, and we'll have a new administration by next year. I am trying to lead my team into the thinking process of this. We have had some thinking process, but it's all these high level things in the department, strategic 10 years to go kind of a thing. But I think by next week, we're actually moving into another thinking process. And I would like to sit down on this, really be able to figure out all these questions, and put the puzzles, the elements into all these questions. So that's it. Nadia, thank you. And for all those I have seen, when I saw you all guys, I was a bit teary-eyed because I kind of remember all my days I'm gonna cry. Sorry, but
Nostalgia.
yeah, I
Since
miss all of
2012.
you.
Yeah.
But thank you for. And I saw also. Who did I see? Yeah, I've seen all of you here. So thank you. That's it, Nadia. Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
very much, Director Ron. So Nevin, that was a long, question and insights from the Philippines. Maybe before you also answer that, we have several more question. No, we have several more suggestions and comments in the chat box. We will put together everything and then we will send it to GADRRRES. But yeah, I'll give you the floor to give a final, answer to Director Ron's reflections and comments. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Nadia. I mean, I don't think I have answers for the director's comments because these are some of the issues we've actually also been struggling with in terms of going through this update/revision, right? And so as an example, there was debate early on: do we do a full dramatic revamp, or do we try to sharpen what's there and address some of these issues through the materials? And I think that there was a collective decision made to use the overall structure of what's there and try to tackle some of these issues that the director has noted, which are spot on. I mean, I think very, very good ones to comment on. And I mean, she did miss the first part of it, so hopefully some of these issues have been addressed. And when colleagues from the Philippines, if you have a chance over the next week, I mean, not only in addition to providing the very good comments now to us that we can try to address and sharpen moving forward, but any additional comments would be really great and very much appreciated. I think just quickly on the issue of the terminology around DRR, preparedness, response recovery, and so on, that people in the DRR sector are quite familiar with. I think that's the right way to go, actually. And the way that the framework is presented is that it fits into this kind of continuum in a sense, right? And again, there was some debate around the pillars, but the idea is that the pillars are these things that provide this kind of a comprehensive framework across different areas within the education sector broadly that you can choose from depending on what the context specific needs are, right? So I think, yes, absolutely, you can. I mean, the idea is that you select based on what is actually needed and relevant in a particular context. And I mean, I was smiling when you were talking about the learning facilities, because there was quite some heated internal debate and disagreements around this particular issue, especially in the naming of this pillar, right? And so, I mean, we can definitely still revisit this, but there was certainly quite a number of people who were pushing very strongly to go beyond using the term school facilities and trying to capture this notion of learning where the children are, irrespective of where it is, right? So, the text in the document, hopefully addresses this issue by going beyond just the school facilities to, really lay out that we're talking about wherever the learners are. And again, this notion of equity, the kids who are in school and out of school. So I think these are all really excellent points, actually, that you've raised. And smiling because we've been struggling with trying to resolve some of them as well, because the issues you've pointed to are, some countries have had less challenge than others, but these are actually quite commonly experienced issues and challenges. And this notion of the convergence around climate change and education, I think it's a very good one in some respects. Even though the original reason for the CSSF framework itself was in response to the Sendai framework, I think what we've seen over time is the growing number of hazards that require kind of risk-informed approaches in the education sector, climate change being one of them. And so the framework tries to create this conceptual understanding, if you will, through this all hazards approach, and looking at the context specific kind of analytical tools that one would use to identify what are those key risks or hazards that would need to be responded to. So, and there is supplemental guidance within the framework that tries to help policy planners and practitioners do this and respond or strategize accordingly. And I think, again, I was just reading something a moment ago, this intersection between climate change and conflict. I mean, there's an event going on this Friday where, with ECW and UNHCR and a few other partners globally, where they're talking about how now climate change is actually a greater source of displacement than conflict is, right? But it's also leading to conflict. So again, I mean, I think these conceptual linkages are there. The problem is, and again, not surprisingly, and I won't go on too much about this, and it'd be great to have a bilateral as well. But I think the problem has been, when you've got multiple hazards, in place, you've got risks of conflict, whether it's in the southern Philippines, compounded by risks of, typhoons, and, maybe a volcano might go off as well. And then you've got soil degradation, and, maybe you're going to have an economic collapse as well at the same time. And you've got hyperinflation, and all of these different kind of hazards and risks are kind of compiling. How do you deal with all of that, right? So or maybe you've only got one of a long list of things to deal with. So the idea with the tool, the framework, is that it will help people identify what those different hazards are, and then how one might be able to respond accordingly. But again, I think the comments you made were great, and we're very happy to receive more of them, and look at how we can even improve and improve upon what's been attempted in this update. Especially on this idea of the school facilities, and how that's being referred to in the document. But very good points. Thank you so much. Back to you, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Nevin. And since we're running out of time, we're now closing the Q&A session, and we will be putting together all the questions that we've gathered from this meeting, and then we will send it back to GADRRRES. I think all of the questions in the chat box were answered somehow in the discussion, but we will still be providing you the copies of these questions, and including the comments and suggestions. And thank you again, Nevin, for this opportunity to have a discussion with you, and for accepting our humble questions and clarifications and comments on the draft CSS framework. So yeah, I'll be returning. I will be handing over the floor to Nia now for the closing of this meeting. Thank you very much.
He might have trouble opening his mic, I'm not sure, but I just wanted to thank you as well, colleagues, and for not just inviting me, but also patiently listening to me talk a lot. So, incredible patience and resilience on your part, sitting through that. But I hope it was helpful and useful. And we're just incredibly excited to engage with you and get all your really rich and incredibly useful and important feedback. And we're looking forward to receiving that. So thank you as well so much. Back to you.
Yeah, we still, I think we, yes. Okay, I think Nia is having some difficulty with his mic right now. Nia, can you please move the PowerPoint slide to the next one? So on behalf of the APCSS, the Asia Pacific Coalition for School Safety, we would like to thank everyone who has been part of this brief meeting to discuss the Comprehensive School Safety Framework document, and we will be sending you an email regarding the link to the tool for further feedbacks and comments that GADRRRES will be providing us. So with this, we will be formally closing the meeting and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.